Happy midweek with the mead maker. Well, mead makers this week. So I have Kieran with me, and he's a great mead maker himself. And tonight we're just gonna have a conversation.
Hello.
Kieran, you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. What's up?
All right. So Kieran discovered Bergen House right after we opened, right?
Yeah, I think right when you opened. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Kieran and I have one major point of difference in the way that we make mead. What's that, Kieran?
I like good mead. No, I mean I like sweet mead, and Talon likes dry mead. Is that the sweetness is the primary difference?
Yeah. Other than that, it seems like our philosophies are pretty similar. And tonight, what I think would be a great place to start is idea generation and then what we do with it from there. And I think it'll be interesting to kind of note the differences between the two of us. And then in future series is coming up, we're going to talk about the actual process of making mead. So over the next several weeks, I'm going to be making mead live and letting people ask questions. So without further ado, where do you usually start, Kieran?
I usually start with one or two like flavors that I want to play with, and I think that usually comes from an idea of either. So right now, for example, this giant mug does not have mead. This tiny glass does have mead. I do have some, but this giant glass has a tea in it, and so I'm drinking it. And I'm like, wow, actually, there's some pretty cool flavors in here. I wonder if I could make that into a mead. Or wow, I like this fruit flavor. I wonder if I could make that into a mead, and then would that be complemented well with any secondary flavor or tertiary flavor or a combination of spices or things to add in. Like I start with a base idea, and then build onto that. I also tend to, as we kind of already discussed, I stay with primarily sweeter meads. But some of it will also depend for recipe generation on like who am I making it for? Am I making it for myself? I'm going big and strong and sweet, and it's going to be heavy and it's going to be thick because that's what I'm looking for. But if I was making something for you, I probably wouldn't do that. I would try to make something different, maybe a little bit
Sure.
on the drier side or lighter ABV or something like that, because I know those are your preferences. So those are some ideas about how I kind of start the approach. I don't know if that. What do you do?
So basically, if I'm hearing you right, your art imitates life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think for a long time, it's literally just like you walk through a grocery store and you see something and you're like, I can ferment that. So for the longest time, that's kind of where my approaches come from. And then I ask a similar question to you, asking what's that secondary flavor? What's going to complement this? I love the flavor Bible for that. I haven't really referenced the flavor Bible as often recently because I've got like core ideas. So I think like with the tea you're talking about, that's an excellent example where I'll pull the tea and I'll be like, all right, there's a little bit of astringency here, and I know that I am going to need something a little bit sweeter to balance that astringency out. And I think that that's kind of how I approach things now. I guess similar to you, rather than wanting to ferment everything, I only have the 3 fermenters at Bergen House. So it's a little bit limited, right? And I think when I first started home brewing, it was that way too. It was like you only have so much fermentation capacity. And then near the end of my home brewing, that was when I had dozens of plastic buckets. And so that limitation wasn't there. So I was just, if it'll ferment, it should ferment. And I think time, money, and capacity limits that a little bit more. Where I get that same type of thing that you're kind of describing, where I'll engage with a flavor and then build from there. So once you have an idea, you're looking at that secondary flavor, what do you engage with for that flavor? Or is it just something that comes to you?
That's such a good question, and I think it differs a lot, and it's very case by case. So again, like, am I making it for myself or someone else? Am I just straight up experimenting? Like, if I'm experimenting, we're just gonna see what happens. You know, is
All
a little
bets
bit
are
how I
off.
feel. You know, all bets are off. Like, I've got this thing and this thing. Let's put it together. Reasonably, it seems like those flavors in my mind might work, but like, who knows what's going to happen when it ferments or whatever the case may be. Um, I do try to pay attention to, am I doing something in a primary fermentation cycle because it's going to fundamentally change the flavors, right? Like, I do a lot of the more successful ones that I've done are blueberry based, and like fermented blueberry doesn't taste the same as regular blueberry, right? Like, it's got a fundamentally different flavor to it because of that process. And so,
Yeah.
unless if I don't know what something tastes like fermented already, then for me that's total experimental territory. And I'm like, I don't know what fermented cherry tastes like off the
Oh,
top of
that's an
my
excellent
head.
point.
Like, it's just different. And so trying to compare those, a lot of what I've done also pairs with what honey I have available.
Sure.
So like, right now I've got a giant bucket of clover honey, which is very neutral, right? So I can do a lot of stuff with secondary flavorings, but it's not going to carry a lot of honey flavor forward with it if I kept it as traditional or otherwise. Whereas I have a smaller bucket of a monofloral blueberry blossom honey, which is like a roller coaster of flavor, right? So that's something I consider too. To continue on like the blueberry train for a second, if I was making something that was like a blueberry, like I call it like blueberry all the way down, it's like I'm going to try to use full blueberries in primary fermentation. I'm going to try to use no water. I'm going to try to use a no water mead, like a blueberry juice instead, or very little water, maybe some tea for tannins and whatnot. I'm going to try to use some blueberry honey, but I'm going to try not to waste it as much on the primary fermentation and instead use that for back sweetening to really get the flavor more pure from that honey. And then I'm going to do
blueberry honey. It's a little bit more acidic, right?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. And then I'm going to do full blueberries in secondary as well, and maybe some blueberry juice to regain some of that volume loss from the racking. And that's going to be like fermented blueberry and straight up blueberry and blueberry juice and blueberry honey. And so you're going to get that full capacity of flavor there. It would be something that I would do.
Right. So for me, a lot of times I want to express like thoughts that people can come back in a sessionable way. So obviously with like the estrogen that I tapped that wasn't too much of a concern of mine. It's 18%. That barrel is big. It's bold. But when I put something on tap, I really want to express something that keeps you coming back for a little bit more. Whether it's that a second one of the same glass or a second one of something else. So I think that probably defines a lot of what my approach is. And that speaks to what you said about understanding your audience. Yeah. Right. Because I tap that. I want people to take that home. Synthesis, take it home. That was the first one I ever back sweetened at Bergen. Take it home, enjoy it, come back and get another bottle some other time. Whereas, ginger, totally different. I want to drink 2 or 3 while I mow the lawn, and I want other people to enjoy at Bergen.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense, right? Is what's your target audience, and that helps. Obviously that helps dictate everything from what's the percentage ABV you're targeting. Influences a lot of what you do, right? It influences your yeast selection, the amount of sugars you're putting in there, the nutrient, like all that stuff.
So do you start with like a blank piece of paper and then build from there, or do you kind of wing it?
I don't as much start off on the paper. I'd say I'm more on the wing it side of things in a sense. But I started off with paper recipe development, and then because I've gotten a few like things pretty formulaically mathed out now, I can kind of start with the baseline that I use. So like I know when we've talked, and you might ask me like, okay, like but how much honey are you using? I'm like, I use 3 pounds per gallon. Like that's my baseline, and then I go up or down from there based off of what other additives I'm putting in there. I do use some applications to do like mead calculations to figure out what are my sugars and how much percentage is that roughly going to calculate to. And I always gravity read it and do the specific gravity for original and as throughout as we measure to make sure I'm more accurately determining what that percentage, the conclusion of fermentation, all that stuff. But I always start off with 3 pounds per gallon. And then I select my yeast based off alcohol tolerance range and also any desirable characteristics from that might express in terms of flavorings or otherwise. And then go to what are the primary flavors I'm going with this, or vice versa sometimes. So, for example, I have a blueberry sizer right here. I think I gave you a bottle of it to try at some point. And I might say, okay, I can make this blueberry sizer 18%. Or I could make it 8%, or I could make it 14%. My actual recipe changing there just really comes down to how much fruit am I putting in that primary, how much honey am I putting in that primary, and what yeast am I using. So if I want that heavier mead, I'm gonna front load it a little bit. I might step feed it with the honey depending on what's necessary. But that's where I'd start from is what's that percentage and that target audience and that flavor, and then go from there using that 3 pounds per gallon as my baseline. And that's specifically honey to mead output ratio.
So this is really good. I think a lot of people that are going to watch this video, they're going to start asking some questions.
Sure.
And you said some really valuable little nuggets there. We talked about step feeding, pounds of honey per gallon. You mentioned that you use some tools to kind of guesstimate, and then in the back end, you verify with a hydrometer. And I think that all of those things are going to be missing for our entry level audience.
Yeah.
Hopefully, as we grow this kind of video cast, we'll start to garner an audience that wants to be involved, and they'll gain that knowledge. So I guess.
Yeah, it's a bit jargony. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're good. I think that's healthy, and that's actually part of the point of these video casts, to say, if you're interested in the art, let's talk about it. Be a part of the conversation. If you're not interested, that's cool. You know that Wednesday night's the video to skip, and that's fine. So let's backtrack, nerd out a little bit here.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
You want to talk about yeast selection? You mentioned you use a larger variety of yeast than I do. I have 4 primary ones I use, and that's because I know what to expect from them. And I've stopped making small batches of mead. I'll make a 15-gallon batch because I have the half barrel, but that's only to increase my capacity. Yeah. Typically, I'll jump right in with that 100-gallon batch. So having my 4 yeasts in my pocket, knowing exactly how they act, why they act that way, and how I can treat them to manipulate them, then that's a tool. And I think that there will come a time when I have a greater capacity and I can leverage that half barrel system, or even a couple more half barrels, and I'll be able to add more yeast to my arsenal. But so you using more yeast than I do, how do you pick it? Do you go on to like lavulin.com and look at the catalog?
Yeah, I use a lot of references from people who have been doing this longer than I have, or
Sure.
Online forums are a great solution. You can obviously, as you mentioned, you can look up the actual spec sheets for these yeast strains from Lavulin and Kveik and whatever the other ones are, right? The several companies that commercially produce these yeast strains to figure out some of their characteristics, or obviously just look at the package of them, right? It gives you some of that. Some of them tell you more straight up, like, yeah, this is the alcohol tolerance range and this is the temperature range and things like that. For me, there's four factors that I weigh in for yeast selection. It's primarily alcohol tolerance, because that's one of the biggest decision points for me. Am I trying to make a 12% yeast mead? Am I trying to make an 18% or higher mead? Am I trying to make a less than 10% mead, right? Those are going to be different yeast selections, because I don't really want to mess with that other math of like that 3 pounds per gallon, or redo calculations every single time. For a batch or two, I'll do it, but not all the time. The second thing that is really important to me is the temperature range. I'm in New Hampshire. Sometimes the temperatures get funky. It was 50 degrees yesterday, and we're expecting it to be a nor'easter tonight, and we get 1.5 feet of snow. That's the world we live in right now. And so, depending on how well insulated my home is, or the bathroom, or wherever the place is that I'm storing the stuff over time, can also factor in there. Is it summer? Is it winter? It's going to matter, because I know that my house is going to be within this degree temperature range. And so if I'm confident that my insulation is good, and I don't have a drafty cupboard or closet or whatever it is that I'm storing, that's less of a factor. But I certainly would use different yeasts probably in the summer to play with what, as you mentioned, like that manipulation of some of the characteristics. Like Kvike is what I'm thinking of. That I actually just tried for the first time. I just tried Kvike Voss for the first time this January. It's not meant for winter. It really isn't, but it's not. It was fine because the temperature range of my house was within the okay range, because its range is quite large. But I'm actually really excited to try that again in the summer, and intentionally leave it in a place where it can get hotter, because it's going to express differently. So that temperature range is important. The alcohol tolerance range is important. And then the other two factors that are a little bit less important for me, but I do consider, is the flocculation of the yeast. So like, how compact is that yeast cake going to be at the bottom? I'm trying to be cognizant of jargon now and do it when I can. So how compact or how stringy bits are all those leaves going to be? The little yeasty strands in the must and in the mead, or not?